Hi, I'm Reed. This is Crowline Publishing. Welcome back to our semi-regular series on fantasy subgenres, and today we are doing urban fantasy. Now, urban fantasy, modern fantasy, sometimes called dark fantasy, is simply fantasy that takes place in our contemporary modern world, Buffy style, or it takes place in a world where fantasy has evolved to look like our modern world, Final Fantasy styles. Now, we're going to focus on the first, so when I talk about urban fantasy, that's generally what I'm talking about. But if you want that sort of high-tech fantasy world, well, I think that this video will be useful to you. Now, urban fantasy comes in two basic settings. The most common type, and this is what you're going to generally see on TV, is the supernatural world of demons, angels, werewolves is hidden. People don't know about it. That knowledge is reserved only for a very special few people, and this is Angel, Buffy, Rivers of London, Harry Dresden, American Gods, the Hellboy movie. PCs become aware of a secret world. Most people do not know about it, and sometimes there's even a kind of effect hiding the supernatural world. World of Darkness calls this the masquerade. Or the world has changed, or it's always been different, and vampires and ghoulies and Frankensteins or whatever have come into the light. True Blood, Anita Blake, Hellboy comics, Shadowrun for example. Sometimes it's also a big alternate history. You can do that if you like, but it's a lot of work. Now, generally speaking, PCs in a game like this are inextricably bound to the supernatural world. Once in every generation, a Slayer is born. Your father was a dangerous warlock, or a Dracula, or a Frankenstein. Maybe you witnessed something and were dragged into the supernatural world, or an accident gave you powers, or you bought the wrong magical amulet and you became the focus of an international conspiracy of monsters and sorcerers. And so campaigns tend to revolve around protecting the secret world from people, protecting people from the secret world, being kinds of police, a lot of Monster of the Week style episodes. And generally speaking is that you find that there are factions that the players work against. Hundreds of demon clans united together. The unseelie fairies want to overthrow the city against the benevolent light fairies, or maybe the Black Quarter of vampires has had enough of bowing down to humanity and only the PCs can stand up against them. That's generally speaking how these things look. Now, similar to superheroes, and this is quite interesting, urban fantasy has an emphasis on civilian lives, on romance, on melodrama. You find a lot of young school-age protagonists in urban fantasy. Big one for melodrama. Oh no, turns out my dad was an evil Frankenstein. Oh no, my boyfriend is a werewolf. It's much less about quests, wealth, experience points, and the other things that we've covered, like Hyborian fantasy or medieval fantasy. It's a lot more about the ongoing job of protecting people with an emphasis on interpersonal drama. DMs and players alike, when they're getting ready for an urban campaign, plan for maximum drama, secret parents, childhood traumas, imposters, hidden agendas, betrayal from the past. All that stuff is fantastic. That's what players will be after if you are looking to emulate this genre. And as a DM, do you want to directly emulate a show like Buffy or Grimm or whatever, using the dynamics and settings, translating into more of a fantastic D&D kind of a world? See how it goes. A lot of world building goes into making a secondary world, or even a world that has a significant alternate and fantastic history, but that's part of the fun, isn't it? So I would recommend that if you're trying this out for the first time, that you just do a real world, shoehorn in D&D rules into it. If it works out well, if you enjoy it, then try and make it more of a D&D fantasy game, of a Final Fantasy game. It's just easier. Now, given that we're going to just stick to talking about modern urban fantasy right now, the first thing that you need to do is your character special or not? Because there's a lot of scope to be just a normal person without a magical destiny, or dragon blood, or training in the mystical arts of Ekithump or whatever. In Buffy, this is Xander. It's Lauren and Kenzie and Lost Girl. In fiction, these kinds of characters work really, really well. They get stuff explained to them, they get kidnapped, they fall in love with bad guys, they are continuously sort of ways into the plot. This is fantastic in a work of fiction. It is not always fun for a PC. No matter how much you want to be the Xander, no matter how much you want to be the Zeppo, when you're not contributing to combat very effectively, it can feel like you are left out. When you're not doing all sorts of, I summon the godhead, I stake the vampire, what do? Oh, I buy some chips. It can, no matter how much you want to emulate the genre, it's just not as much fun for a PC to do, so be aware of that going in. But the main PCs in urban fantasy are special. Now, this will obviously rely on the specifics of your campaign, but maybe you stumbled onto real magic somehow. You were the last of the ancient line of vampire hunters, the final Van Helsing. You bought a sword on a whim. Oh, snap! Turns out it's Excalibur. Now, Dark Elves are after your shapely ass because they want that sword. I find as a DM that it is so much easier to create a kind of player faction, the Knights Templars, the Vampire Hunting Club, whatever. You should also be aware that urban fantasy is absolutely, gloriously a genre of special snowflakes. You are going to get a lot of half dragons with flowing blue hair. You are going to get a lot of very handsome, very tough, very sensitive werewolves. You're going to get a lot of lost elven princesses. You're going to get people who are cursed, with dramatic, awesome powers. You will be doing a lot of reskins of player races. This is part of the fun of the genre. If you cannot commit to this, you are not going to have a good time with urban fantasy. Now, we've said before, D&D works best in medieval settings, so I would not by choice use it to emulate modern fantasy. But we all know how some groups are set in their ways. It's part of why this is a D&D channel and not anything else. But we can pretty easily reskin SWAT tactical armor to be plate mail and that sort of stuff. Again, I specifically don't think that D&D handles anything more than black powder weapons very well at all. So I tend to have a rule that supernatural creatures need to be killed by medieval weapons, so you don't have to, start up an Uzi or anything like that. Magic geezers or some, that is the ancient curse of technology. But if you really want to strap half a pound of C4 to a beholder, I, for one, am certainly not going to stop you. Now, D&D is all about classes. It's what makes D&D D&D. Let's break this down by class. Barbarians, just highly skilled fighters. You could make them some sort of weird fantasy clan, Irish Redcaps, or a Highlander, or anything like that. You can go into totems and make them far more spiritual, make them sort of shamanic figures, protectors of the clan. Spiritually gifted protectors is what I'm getting at. Anything that, clings to the old ways is a great barbarian. Bards, smart academic characters mainly. That's how they best translate to the modern world. And of course, there's so much other kind of grounds that a bard can cover. A musician who has somehow stumbled into demon magic. Maybe you were a musketeer brought forward in time. Maybe you want to slowly represent a character learning about the secret world and slowly gaining little bits of knowledge. Bards cover so much ground. Clerics. Any kind of magician could be a cleric. Perhaps you're a religious kid who considers these new powers the gift of the gods. Maybe you're a Wiccan or a pagan priestess and your god actually does give you power. I would just reskin them as any kind of mage, any kind of magician, any kind of sorcerer. It's just a different discipline. Druids are just always going to be popular in urban fantasy for three main reasons. 1, shape-changing. It's just a very popular trope. 2, fae and fairies are popular elements again in the subgenre, and druids can be built around them. And number 3, druids can emulate folk magic, nature magic, ecological green themes, and again, these are all very, very popular in urban fantasy. Fighter can be anything, from a knight to a retired soldier to a scrappy kid with a slingshot. Monks. Now, obviously, it's just a human martial artist who somehow learned an occult martial art. But I would also use a monk if I wanted to have a character who had physical and magical abilities, but didn't want to have to show them, didn't want to have a body that was necessarily monstrous. I'm thinking here about a character like Spike and Angel out of Buffy. They don't have to look monstrous if they don't want to, but they can still hit extremely hard. They can still jump 10 feet in the air. So any kind of physical martial arts based supernatural entity, I would just reskin with a monk. Paladins are a classic urban fantasy character. They are proactive. They want to be there. They have sought out power to fight. The gods have chosen them. They have looked towards gaining special powers. They have a cause that they believe in and they move towards it. This is how you would do a character like Buffy, like a chosen one. Classic paladin example urban fantasy is Michael from the Dresden Files. Religious man, given a magic sword, and he has powers that he uses to fight evil. Classic character class. Ranger, shadowy urban survivalist. Regular park ranger, city shaman. Someone blessed with animal powers if you want to double down on that companion. You could make a dangerous sniper or assassin. Obviously, urban-themed rangers are going to be good. Urban fantasy takes place in urban environments. I always like rangers as being part of an order. Like, go with the Tolkien Rangers, the source material. I think that a group of tough monster hunters with a touch of supernatural powers is a really, really effective kind of faction for players to be. So I highly recommend Rangers. Rogues, same as fighters, anything. Horrible assassin, charming conman, sworn blade of the darkness, Sherlock Holmes style detective, wily cop, action scholar. There are so many ways to be a rogue. Just, again, how supernatural do you want to be? Sorcerer. As we've said, parentage, it's a common theme in urban fantasy. A lot of people like to play with themes of being traumatized and victimized and alienated by their powers. I think you should look at no further than Bo from Lost Girl. She is a succubus. Her powers are quite dangerous to herself and to others. She wants to use them, just takes a while for her to get them under control. I would highly recommend that you really engage with your bloodline powers and your bloodline ancestry. The same as with warlocks. With warlocks, you really want to embrace the role-playing hooks. Your father is the devil, and that makes you afraid that your power is always going to be evil and you are always evil. Or maybe you come from a long line of an ancient cult and you are struggling to break away. I think great examples are Vanessa Ives from Penny Dreadful, I love Stark from Sandman Slim, Raven from Titans, or perhaps you are a warlock and you're sworn to good. You try to do good things. You use this power in the service of, niceness and puppies, but like the powers that be from Angel, their good is not always your good. Wizard, no need to get too far into it. At some point you found and experimented with and discovered an aptitude for magic. Willow is for sure a wizard. Races and parentage are likely to be very important for urban fantasy, and remembering fae, shape changes, half demons, undead, they're the kind of popular races that turn up over and over again in the genre. So be prepared to reskin Genasi as elementally aspected creatures. Tieflings are always important. Elves and Eldarin, the various kinds of fae, Shadakai, Drow. There's always creepy dark elves and guys who wear sunglasses all the time. And really, this is the place where the subgenre comes alive. There's multiplicity of races and factions all competing against each other. So really respect and encourage the creativity of your players. And in fact, let them guide your world building rather than just you coming in and saying, here's what you can play. Ask the players what they would like. It's just one of the hallmarks of urban fantasy. Alright, so that's characters, but what about enemies? I think one of the first things for a DM to do is to decide on what are the enemies of your campaign. Urban fantasy does a lot of monster of the week. It does a lot of human forehead rubber monsters as well, basically just Star Trek aliens. And you can emulate the genre if you want, but the reason why the enemies are mainly rubber forehead monsters is just budget. You should feel free to throw in a Thessal Hydra tearing up the local high school. Feel free to have a Beholder, tearing down to pieces. But what urban fantasy has, even more than monsters, is factions. It has enemies that you can meet, talk to, hate, sleep with, redeem, be betrayed by. It's very much all about interpersonal drama. If I was doing an urban fantasy campaign, I would take cop show style bad guys and give them a supernatural edge. A drug dealer, it's a vampire sharing his blood. The city's overall crime lord, it's a red dragon no one can take on. A gang who controls the sewers, dark elves, kobolds, whatever. Amusing comedy baddies, a rival gang of silly, pitiable little goblins. A scary monster who steals children, a demon. A man collecting a woman's souls in a horrible Tinder plot. It's a mummy looking to come back to life. And I would base those factions on the kind of PCs I was getting. If I was getting a lot of fae, Unseelie, Bad Court would be the enemies. If it was a lot of shape changes and there were a lot of werewolves and stuff, I would make them a rival werewolf gang, or were hyenas, or were panthers, or some opposite were. If I was a lot of half demons, I would make full demons the enemies. Hell has come up to earth and wants its wayward children back. If you were a bunch of vampires, you've got to be somehow good guys. So maybe you are vampires who just feed on emotion, but these are the vampires who feed on pain. Opposite numbers are fantastic for urban fantasy. And lastly, what kind of adventures are these guys going to go on? Now, I wouldn't recommend this for all genres, but I would write out an urban fantasy campaign as a pitch document. Think of it like a television show, because that is generally speaking what your PCs are going to want from you. So what unifies all the PCs? Are they friends, family? Are they soldiers in the same war, students in the same class, hunted by the same monster? What are some NPCs they might have in common? Do they share a stern mentor, beloved teacher, a wayward mother? Has the same demon preyed on all of them? What's your setting? High school? Uni? A hospital? Just friends? When thinking about creating interesting locations in an urban fantasy setting, I would highly recommend that you try the Dresden Files RPG. It specializes in this kind of work. It's entirely a genre fiction emulator. Have a look at it. Yes, it's not for D&D, but it will give you a lot of interesting ideas on how to collaboratively world build in a way that's perfect for this kind of world. As for actual adventures that you want to go on each week, I think there is about 200 hours of urban fantasy on TV a week. There is just books about this all the time. You might want to read my Lark Case Files novels, just saying. There is a huge amount of ideas for you to crib from. I would, however, just a quick note, Monster of the Week is a classic example. Monster of the Week is good, give it a little bit of a twist. The monster was a patsy, the monster was being used, the monster was being blackmailed, the monster was just feeding its young. And remember, always, you want tragedy, you want sadness, you want betrayal, you want melodrama in urban fantasies. You want to have your players say to you, here is what you are going to mess my PC up with. Here's my evil dad, here's my evil mum, here's my evil stepbrother, here's my evil dark secret, here is my guilt, here is my shame, here is what I do not want anyone to ever know. Please, please bring it on as soon as you can. I really wish we could have talked more about sort of techno fantasy, Final Fantasy style fantasy, but I feel that we've covered a lot of the ground. If you take some of the principles here, you'll be alright. I think urban fantasy is a huge amount of fun. I think that your players would really, really appreciate this kind of D&D game. There is a reason why there's about 200 hours each week of urban fantasy TV on. Play up the melodrama, play up the special snowflakeness, play up the, oh my god, but that means that my sister is secretly my daughter's dragon, and you will have a great old time. Please like the video, please tell your friends. We're on the Twitter, we're on the everything. I'm Reed, we'll see you next time. Bye bye.